If you find you're unsettled listening today, reach out to a trusted friend or go to tradespodcast.com and click on resources.
We are men in the trades, forging health in the drug poisoning crisis. This is
Off the Clock Toolbox Talk.
Hey, we're back with Constructive Coercion Part 2, and we're picking up exactly where Dr. Jeremy Milloy, Trevor Botkin, and myself left off in Part 1, explaining what the hell constructive coercion is and how we've been affected by it.
Not just we can do something about it. There was a belief in the late 60s and early 70s that the workplace was the key area in society that people could make an impact in substance use disorder, or what we would call addiction back then. Because if you think about, America and Canada in the 60s and 70s, right? You're thinking of drug use is becoming noticeably more mainstream with hippies and the rise of the counterculture. It's a huge baby boom. So there's all these young people, and we know young people tend to party more, they tend to drink more, they tend to do more drugs. So these things are very visible in society, and people are really concerned. And down here in the US, people are really concerned that service people are getting hooked on heroin in Vietnam and are going to bring that back and not be able to compete in the workplace. So all these things happen, but there's this real belief that work is the place that you can make people change. Everything was built around a new model that they called constructive coercion. And the belief was,
Constructive coercion.
Constructive coercion. You could probably make a pretty good construction industry podcast with that title, I would imagine.
Yeah, great. Yeah, super helpful title. Yeah,
super helpful stuff. And people were super into it. So constructive coercion meant you needed to double down on the fact that the supervisor had power over a worker in a workplace to watch you, to intervene in your behavior, and to threaten you with firing or suspension. And you could use that to transform addiction, or using the disease mindset that was prevalent back then to break through denial, right? And for some reason, there was always this belief that an addict will give up their children, they'll give up their spouse, but if you threaten their job, they'll break through denial, which is like always hilarious to me, because there's a lot of jobs where I'm like, if you could pick that or your spouse, right? Like I mean any job, but like
totally
the fact that I was like, how good do you people think these jobs are?
Yeah, right.
But this was the belief that it played this central role in people's life identity, and this was, I think, fairly gendered as well, that you could crack people and get them into treatment. And the belief was that this would not be a witch hunt. So the supervisor was not supposed to say, hey, Trevor, I think you smell like booze. I think you have a problem with alcohol. They're supposed to say, hey, your work has been slipping.
Right.
And I've noticed that, this is shoddy. So what I'm thinking is maybe you need to see the counselor and talk about a possible problem with alcohol, which
right.
It meant that it was like, well, supervisors will not have to diagnose alcoholism, but if they're diagnosing your work problem is based on their perception that you're an alcoholic, they're still diagnosing alcoholism.
What's the difference?
I can't understand how that's a huge difference, but that's how they did it. And so with this increased belief that this was like the modality that you could identify and treat people, and increased funding, there becomes all this funding available from the state in Canada and the US, and employers are really investing in it, and unions are on board. These expand out, and they expand out from initially being about alcohol, they're first called industrial alcoholism programs, to expand to include drug use, and then they expand to include all kinds of things. Marital problems, debt, all the things that go into what we would now call an employee assistance program. So this is the historical roots of those things.
And what's the timeline on that again?
So that's the 60s, early 70s.
Okay, that makes sense, because I'm just thinking back to I've always worked in kind of the mental health and substance use services field, and it's changed fields. Like it would belong to the Ministry of Health, and then for a period of time, I'm going to say maybe the 80s, it belonged to the Ministry of Labor. And I worked with youth substance use services, and I couldn't understand why that was with the Ministry of Labor. But now that you're saying all this, I'm like, oh, okay, that makes way more sense. And then thankfully, before I kind of came into the field, it went back to Ministry of Health again. But that's really interesting.
That's probably why. That's really interesting that they would house it there, because it was really framed as a workplace concern, and that you can get people to care about it by talking about, how much money we lose every year and how many hours we lose in absenteeism. It was really framed as a work issue. And if you could think about this what's going on like globally at the time in the 70s and 80s. Canada and the US are really freaked out that we're losing our competitive advantage, and that, Japanese companies, German companies, China, Mexico are surpassing jobs in Canada and the US. I think that also prompts some of the concern about labor. So that's the start of the story. And where I take it to is there's this huge bet made on identifying and intervening in problematic substance use through the workplace and through workplace relationships. And by the mid to late 90s, you have the dawning of another opioid problem, an opioid,
Right.
epidemic that y'all are working on, that is centered in the bodies of working class people, right? Like
Mhm.
to the point that it will always stay with me, learning that Purdue Pharma, when they were doing the initial marketing plan for Oxy, they went and listed all the US counties that had the highest rate of workplace injury. And they said, well,
That's
that's where we
incredible.
put our money.
Oh,
And
80s, like they came like wildfire through the industry.
yeah, yeah. And because, I mean, that was targeted. And no, I don't think anyone's really put those two things together and say, well, we made this huge bet that we would be able to identify and treat these problems through the workplace, and actually these problems, were kind of reinforced through the bodies of workers, and how many people have ended up losing their lives, or losing significant parts of their lives, or having massive negative health outcomes because of injuries suffered through work because of substance use disorder picked up through a workplace environment. So I'm kind of trying to put those two pieces beside each other and say what happened.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Just
Countless
thinking,
guys I know, their introduction to opioids was 80s. I mean, that was like, it was both normalized the use of, but also the abuse of is still to this day. Like, whereas the stimulants and stuff are an open secret, the opioids are still this thing that people don't talk about. But that idea of painkillers is very common.
Right.
yeah, I'm thinking about the workers are needing to be on opiates or painkillers or whatever just to get through. And then I'm also now thinking of, the guys up at corporate office who are trying to create these huge profits. And
Yep.
they're also on opioids or cocaine or what stimulants or
Yep.
whatever it is,
Yeah.
to work to get themselves through, because everybody's pushing themselves so hard, so hard. And this is where it kind of comes back to capitalism again. And it's not that you have to be, you're a socialist and you're a capitalist or anything like that, but it's just like, why are we doing this to ourselves? Like what happened? And I'm thinking back to, maybe more rural times where, you worked hard, you had your farm, you're taking care of animals, you're taking care of the land, and you are working hard, but you're not killing yourself every day, right? And
Yeah.
putting all these extra stressors on yourself. And it's like where we lost that connection of our health being the priority, because you're stuck in your body, right? You got to live your life in
Yeah.
your
Yeah, you gotta,
body.
you can't, as we all know, you can't move out. You always come back to your body,
Yeah.
and the
Well,
body
that
keeps
too,
its
like
score, right?
in that farmland rural spirit, like a lot of the prices were set for what you were selling. You were growing a crop every year. The price was set. You knew what you were going to sell it for each year. You weren't competing against the people next to you. You were your own employer. You could set your pace. You knew what you had to do. You got up early and you did it. And I think it was just a far healthier lifestyle, right? And let's face it, like the modern construction industry, even the old construction industry, is not focused in rural areas, has access to things like, I think farming and alcohol probably have a rich heritage,
Oh yeah.
as the isolation and the loneliness and all that. But I think, the construction industry has always had easy access to far better forms of self-medicating.
That's a good point. And it's not even like you say, Trevor, it's about what the incentives are, in
Right.
terms of, whether you're in a pre-capitalist farm economy, you're basically trying to make your nut every year, you're trying to make enough that you
Yep.
make it through the next winter, et cetera. Whereas one of the things that I identified that happened in this big bet that people made on identifying and treating addiction through the workplace is that it puts the incentives at odds, like we were just talking about earlier. If you
Totally.
need to either intervene productively in somebody's substance use, or make sure that they're staying clean, or make sure that a workplace is healthy and people aren't too stressed out, versus you have to, get a job done, or, get more profit this year because your competitors are doing better. The incentives always go that way. So all of these programs end up being really conflicted by the fact that ultimately they are part of a larger profit-seeking mentality, as you said, Karen. Like people going faster and faster, ultimately is harmful for our bodies, and that's where the rubber always meets the road. Is again, like with Simone Biles, if this is going to cost somebody money, what it is we need to get people back on the job. And my wife always says, like, about work, that we override our bodies, that work
Yeah.
encourages us. Even if you're in a less physically demanding job, there's a lot of jobs that require a lot of emotional labor. And, if something really bad happened in your life, then you override it and you go to that meeting and you put a smile on, or you try and sell somebody that car or whatever, right? And whatever's going on with you, you don't get away from it, actually. Physically, emotionally, that stuff comes back at some point. And so I think that was one big way where this ultimately has been limited, because it's not necessarily something that we should expect our employer to necessarily do, right?
Right.
Like it might be the wrong tool for the job, in the sense that the employer's incentives are not the same as a doctor's incentives would be. Like you said off the top, the doctor would say, well, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And it'd be like, yeah, you can call my boss and see how far that's going to go.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I've had that exact. Yeah.
Well, no, I
Right.
had a friend recently who is fighting cancer and is successfully fighting cancer right now. But when she went and the doctor was like, here's what needs to happen, this needs to happen, that needs to happen. And she's like, I can't do that.
Yeah.
I have a very physically demanding job, and there's like hundreds of people that rely on me. I can't do that. And he said, well, you can keep doing what you're doing, or you can live. So you got to make the choices, right? So it's not always that clear, that black and white, but for her it was, and that was quite a slap in the face for her, right? Or a wake up call, really.
And she's probably, I would suggest, being programmed to believe that there's also hundreds of people that are waiting for that job.
Absolutely.
Like not just counting on her, but lined up to take it if she's not there.
Yeah.
Right. That's the culture I came up in, was like, we've got guys that'll replace you.
Yeah.
And that sends a powerful message about what to do if, in terms of, for example, telling your boss that you have a problem with something, right?
Yeah.
You're like, well, then that just downgrades my value.
Yeah, you don't want to stick your hand up. Yeah.
I don't want to deal with him, So
I've worked for employers that literally would tell you, like, we're clearing out, we're getting rid of 10 guys on Friday, and we've got 10 new guys showing up from the union on Monday.
Yeah.
And you're just like, what a terrible work environment. Like, and this is recent. This is like 5 years ago I was in that space, so it's an interesting way to motivate people.
Yeah. And the incentive, so in terms of what your health is going to be like and looking out for your health, it's such a mixed message. And so the other thing with putting this in the workplace is employers are generally, again, and this is no like shade in terms of like, oh, they're doing the wrong thing. This is just how the incentives work. If you're an employer, you want everything to cost less and to take less time. So
That's
these
the way it has
programs,
to be. Yeah.
employ like rehabilitation for substance use disorder in the 70s, a lot of companies had programs where you're getting sent somewhere for inpatient rehab for several weeks, right? Which, as we all know, is like super expensive. And so what is available through people's insurance became whittled down more and more to, nowadays it's usually you get like a 3 to 5 sessions on a Zoom call, maybe with a counselor, and you better hope that that's enough for you. And as we know, recovery looks different for everyone, and that's not necessarily going to fix whatever somebody showed up with.
I'm laughing, and it's not because it's funny. I'm laughing because it's so ridiculous, but that's exactly what it is. And that's trickled down through our entire society now too, because when I used to work with youth and a youth would start seeing me for my services, sometimes the parents would call up and say, how many times does my kid need to see you before they're fixed?
Yeah, right.
I'd be like, oh, that's not how this works. It's very nonlinear.
Yeah.
We're going to take some time just getting to know each other and hang out. And he's like, well, how does that fix things? And it's just like it's supposed to be this thing where you're churning out a result and it all works, very linearly. And yet what actually needs to be done is we need to deconstruct what's going on with the person and all the
Yeah.
contributing factors that that led to where they are right now. But that's super common. Like I hear that from actually we've heard that from lots of different people's stories. About even a couple episodes ago, we just released Anthony's story, and Anthony was talking about he had 4 weeks or 3 weeks to get his treatment done because he had to go back up north again and get it, finish the job or do another job. And it didn't end up turning out like that, because as he started to do his treatment, he realized he needed a lot more time to do that. But that's always the way. And
it's not just the employers. Like
no,
like we see people. I work a lot, like very closely with people that are trying to get on top of their substance use challenges, and they've got weird expectations, right? Like that they're going to go to treatment, or that, oh, I tried treatment and it didn't work. Well, you don't know it yet, but you're a little farther ahead than you were, right? Like we have to build that understanding and awareness of what we're going through and how our life is affecting us. And I think some people it takes once, and sometimes I personally know people that have been to treatment 13 times.
Yep.
And somewhere inside of the first 20 minutes of the 13th time, they're like, the light bulb went on, right? So, we talk, we always,
it's not what employers want to pay for.
No, it's not.
I can go through the archives and show you the things I've said where they're like 3 times and you're done. And again, as we know, that's not how it looks like for people. But again, if you're an employer, the incentives are, why am I sending someone to rehab 6 times? This is ridiculous.
And this is, and I understand that and I agree with it. Like, what's the responsibility, the duty to accommodate? And I think that's why fundamentally this is a public health crisis and it should be treated as a health crisis. I know things are a little different in the US as they are in here in Canada, but I don't view the substance use and the opioid crisis as a mental health challenge. I think of it as a health crisis. Like, we need to be dealing with this in our healthcare. We should have an open door, no barrier. If somebody wants to go and try treatment, I expect employers to be accommodating to people that need to leave work for as long as it takes to get the help they need. I don't think they should foot the bill. I think if my tax dollars are going anywhere, it should be to support people with their health problems and challenges and dealing with this beast. And what I'd love to see society do a better job of is quit counting how many times people try to access care and their setbacks, and just keep encouraging them to keep stepping up to do the work.
And one way it is similar, unfortunately. Our healthcare systems here in the US, and mentally I keep going back and forth geographically where I am, but Canada and the US, it's both very limited mental health services. And I totally agree with you that it's not just a mental health problem. It's like we said, it's a physical health problem. It's just a public health problem. But a lot of what people access in terms of treatment has fallen under the mental health umbrella. And for a lot of people, what makes it even more insidious is those services are available through your job. You have, if you are lucky enough to have access to them, you have access to them because you are employed. So there's, again, this cross purpose in terms of getting help, because you want to get help, but you also don't want to get help that will make you lose your job.
Yeah.
Right?
Totally.
And then you don't have access to that treatment anymore.
100%. The stigma, right? That's where it comes back to, that stigmatizing. And I think at our last time we met, doctor, and shared, you spoke about the, how drug testing and how people admitting to their challenges has been used against them over the years.
And that's a good time to bring up the subject of drug testing, because, as we take it from the story of the huge investment and optimism in the early 70s to the dawning of this opioid crisis in the mid to late 90s, the next step is, as employers in the 80s are less willing to spend the cash that it takes to foot this bill, when it can be enormous, but there's still a belief and an expectation that they should be dealing with this and that this is a huge problem for them. What we see, especially in the US context, where Ronald Reagan and his government are really encouraging this part of the war on drugs, is shifting from treatment and from like destigmatizing approaches to ramping up stigma, ramping up surveillance, and saying, well, we're going to test everybody. And that way, people who use substances are bad people, and through testing, we can find them and get them out of our jobs. And so that just really, really amps up the stigma. And as you all know, just really makes people incentivized to hide if they have a problem, and doesn't do anything for many years to make any of these workplaces safer, right? You just have people getting fired based on whether they had, for example, used cannabis in the previous 3 months. And there's an enormous amount of damage done to people in the 1980s who then, like we just talked about, if they lose their job because of a bad test, they don't have access to rehabilitation in many cases. They don't have access to treatment.
Wow.
And so, things go in a direction that's really not supportive of people's health. It is really about an us and them mentality that people who use substances, period, let alone people with substance use disorder, which we know is a very different set of folks, really are limited in their impact in the workplace. And what this often does too in the present day with testing, and I'd be interested to hear about how this works in the construction and trades, is the creation of a two-tier workforce based on people who have had dirty tests and not. I present often with my friend Andrew Hutchison, who's a union leader of a city workers union in Missouri. And the city that he works in would not stop testing people for cannabis, even though cannabis is legal in Missouri. And so people who had failed a test in the previous few years could not work for the city picking up garbage, even though the city had a shortage of people to do that job, which is essential work. But people who had failed a drug test could get hired by a temp agency and then be hired out to the city to pick up garbage and do that exact same job for $10 an hour less. Right. So we see drug testing being used not in a way where it's anything about workplace safety or helping people, but it is a way to take like an underclass of workers who have this scarlet letter of a failed test that then you can afford to pay much less. And I'd be fascinated to know more about what testing looks like today in the Canadian construction and trades landscape.
I would say in the oil patch, you get a lot of stories of the drug testing and the underground market around beating those tests. The stigma associated with, like, it is a scarlet letter. Like, you do not, you get one of the, I've got countless buddies that have failed one and were dispatched. It's amazing, right? Because, if you admit you have a problem, that triggers a duty to accommodate, right? A duty of care. But if you get caught, you're out, right?
Yeah.
But I would say if you just got caught, they now know you have a challenge, right? Like there should be a duty of care, right? Immediately. No, and I've worked for employers that have said, fire fast. Like, if you think a guy has a problem, let's get rid of him.
Yeah.
Because once we find out he has a problem, we have to
these
do whatever that
I don't
looks
want
like.
to deal with it.
And I don't want to do that. So I've been counseled in my training, like in certain companies, that this is our policy. Like, if you think a person has a problem, let's get rid of them. Well, doesn't matter what it is, let's get rid of them. But once they admit they have a problem, that was the conversation they feared.
The word problem is so telling, and we all use it.
Well, yeah.
But we're people. I have a problem. My name's Jeremy. I'm a human being. Like,
exactly.
Being alive is a series of problems.
Exactly. It's literally what our brain is designed for, is to solve problems.
And to go back to what you said, Karen, that when people are like, can you fix this? Right. And like people, Trevor, you're saying in recovery, being like, I'm going to come here, I'm going to fix this in 2 weeks, I'm going to move on with my life.
Right.
Well, of course they feel that way. A lot of the people have, substance use issues because they can't handle being vulnerable because of trauma or whatever. So of course they're not going to say, I am a mess. I'm broken wide open, right? They're going to say, I'm going to go back to the point where I'm not have a problem anymore.
Yeah.
Totally.
And this is the problem of workplaces. It makes sense for a supervisor who's got a job they need to get done to look at people who use substances as a problem. But like, that is not conducive to people getting healthy or getting better.
No.
Right.
No.
And it's not the reality.
The problem. It's about caring for oneself. And
totally.
Yeah, we've had a couple of people on this podcast talk about, like, up at work camps in the north, and they just always have a little package of pee in somebody else's pee, some clean pee in their underwear, and walk around with it everywhere. So if they get suddenly drug tested, so they're problem solving, and really the employer is probably happy with that, because then they don't have to follow through on anything, and the person is, if they're still functioning well enough to keep doing the job, then everybody's happy. Well,
out of sight, out of mind.
It's theater.
Absolutely.
It's total theater.
Theater.
This is what I've argued, and when I published about drug testing before, it's a hilarious classic capitalist solution to the problem, in that it doesn't make workplaces safer. No. It doesn't make people healthier. But what it does do is create two literally billion-dollar industries, which is the urine testing industry, which we all joke literally turns piss into gold, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
The amount of money places can make doing this, and the fake urine industry. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Two huge industries get created. And that's, I think, the most difficult part of changing that aspect of it. I think a lot of people will realize and will admit, like you said, that this isn't really serving anyone.
No.
But there are some corporations like in places like Quest who make an enormous amount of money out of drug testing, and
Yeah.
they're just a factor in the workplace now.
And this is the thing. Not everybody using the substance has substance use challenges,
Yes.
other than what the unnecessary repercussions of employment practice might cause for them. Like I've known countless guys. My story is that I have challenges with substance use. I am an addict through and through, and I can use anything to mood alter with obsessively if I'm not very careful. That's my reality. But I have known countless guys more than I've known to have problems that pick up, a gram on a Saturday night to go out with friends, maybe once a month, maybe once every 2 months. You cannot find a pattern of use that is challenging. They're outstanding. Like even every addict I know is generally an outstanding individual, right? Like this is not a strike against them.
Well, it's the
But,
stigma too. It's just the stigma. You think
up,
of destigmatized substances like caffeine.
Totally.
Everybody uses caffeine, right? And it's like, and some people have a problem with it. Some people are very negatively, they're dependent on it, right? And some people can use it in an okay way, but it's,
Somebody should do a study on energy drinks, cigarettes, and the construction sector, because I'll tell you, it's doing more damage. But, the reality is you get people with a casual habit, like having a beer after work. Well, you're not grabbing a Coors Light that's got a fentanyl in it. That's one of the challenges of the modern era right now. We're seeing is people with, by all accounts, no problem, could do a drug test and be reprimanded and cut from their job because of something they did on a Saturday. And B, they could pick up a substance and find themselves waking up in a hospital bed if they're lucky. Right. Like if that's lucky to have that outcome. And so that's, I think, one of the new challenges we're facing.
And people make policy based on we need to intervene in substance use disorder, which of course we do. But the fact is that a lot of people are dying, don't have substance use disorder.
No, they don't. They don't see themselves in the problem. Right. They don't see themselves in the statistics.
The thing with the drug, and so the turn to drug testing that we get in the 80s is totally pernicious because number one, there's the stuff we've already mentioned, but there's also the fact that, a lot of people get caught up in it who don't have a problem. Right. And one of the things, though, that we know can lead to you developing a problem and have negative outcomes health wise is losing your job.
Losing your job, exactly.
Which happens to a lot of folks. The other thing is, which Karen, you alluded to, is the focus, and I'll use the word hysteria over drug testing and illegal drugs in the workplace in the 80s was completely out of pocket with what was, and I would say still is, the major drug of abuse and drug of risk and safety harm in the workplace, which is alcohol. This complete focus on cocaine use in the 80s. People in the workplaces are like, guys, our problem's with booze. That's what's going on here. And drug testing, because it is, is so part of this war on drugs mentality, was not really about health. Because if it had been about health and safety, there would have been a much bigger focus on alcohol, which of course was not tested for. And these drugs of abuse that were tested for, all they could have told you was somebody did something in the last week. Didn't tell you whether they showed up impaired or not. And we also know there's all these other factors that are impairing. When you refer to energy drinks and caffeine, people are using those because people are too tired to be at their job.
And there's lots of information.
Ignored in the 80s and 90s was pain. I think the disease model of substance use disorder has a lot of insights in it, and people have gotten a lot out of it and use it for some really good outcomes. But when it was in the 70s and 80s, the exclusive focus on what they called addiction as a disease overlooked trauma and pain to an extent that was really problematic.
Totally.
Especially for working people, right? And we've talked about that briefly, but a lot of these policies they act as if they proceeded, constructive coercion proceeds from a story that, and I've heard your story, Trevor, so I know you can speak to how false this is, that work is over here and problematic substance use is over here, and you can't do both. So if somebody has a job and they have a problem, you're going to be able to tell because their job will suffer. But we know from just being alive and working places And what we also, I've learned, just even more from going back and researching is, of course, quite often people are really good at their jobs and have a really bad substance use problem. More to the point, they're using substance use to be functional at their job, right? Whether we're talking about a nurse who's abusing painkillers to get through the physical demands of a shift, or we're talking about a truck driver who's doing speed all night so that he can make all his deliveries, all of these things. And that's another reason that bringing the disease model into the workplace kind of missed, was the fact that a lot of people are going to use substances to stay functional and meet the demands of the job. And
Right.
pain, of course, is a huge one of those.
Well, not just that work though, but that emotional connection that we needed after work. That's what we bonded over, right? Like, it's not just the painkillers. I mean, there was a lot of times in my career where I did feel stuck, and it was arduous getting through those days in the rain, in the snow, in the cold weather, just heavy. And what, you kind of in the back of your mind, you're just like, those beers are going to be great after work, or, it's going to be good to get together with these guys and do a few lines, right? Like,
but it's that emotional
that was
connection
life.
too. You get a dopamine hit, your body's natural
You get dopamine hit.
when
You
you're
have something to look forward to.
and some
like a little mini
oxytocin
vacation.
and all that when you're connecting with your buddies. And you've talked about that before, Trevor, about how motivating that was for you, was to be part of that brotherhood,
huge.
right? So that's
because we were suffering together. Like, that was that thing we were doing together. And then after work, we were all going to go and reward ourselves for getting through that. And there was no big vacation to look forward to. What's that?
That's explicit sometimes, right? Like we've all had probably had to do a really brutal shift, and your boss take you out and get you a bunch of drinks, right?
100%. Totally. Very common in the industry to celebrate these things. And I will say, like, admittedly, there were days I would have failed a drug test where the night before I was with my employer, because that was it was totally part of the normalized drug. The culture of the industry supported that, right? Yeah, it was just normalized.
Things like that push us towards where we need to go. Whereas we can't treat these issues like they're coming from outside the workplace. I'm always like, like the call's coming from inside the house. Like, these things are happening because they are part and parcel of how we do the job and how we recover from the job. And until we have workplace policies that are actually about that and realize that, but it's an enormous challenge, because what it does require slowing down, and it does require having greater spaces in our society for vulnerability and care, and leaving the workplace and coming back, and things that we're taught are you're damned if you do it. There's not a lot of support for doing things like this.
Well, I hear a lot of it all the time is that we won't be competitive. Like, what good is it if we fail as a company after we can't be competitive in our bids? We can't, and I'm like, sometimes you got to do the right thing, and if the industry, could somehow tackle this in a unified approach where we're just not willing to take those things. And I think that's where unions come in, right? Unions have done an okay job of trying to institute universal rules that apply to our duty of care and standards of work and all that stuff, right? So that everybody is competing against other people with the same rules of engagement.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, thank you so much for being here. I think we could probably talk for hours and hours, or maybe Trevor and I should just come and take some of your classes, because I think that'd be amazing.
I'm in.
I thank you. I really enjoyed talking with you both, and I love your show. I'm going to keep listening, but I'd love to come back in the future. Hopefully in the next couple of years, this book will finally be out, and we could come back and talk a bit more then, if you're up for it.
Fantastic. We'll definitely take you up on that.
Off the Clock Toolbox Talk has been a Fraser House Society project, executive produced and co-hosted by Karen Jansen, managed by Delan Young on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. Production of this material has been made in part through a financial contribution from Health Canada. The views expressed herein do not necessarily reflect the views of Health Canada or Fraser House Society. The content of this podcast is conversation between people with living experience and should not be taken as professional advice. Special shout out to the Construction Foundation of BC, where the vision is to improve the social economic health of our communities by supporting young people to obtain their Red Seal endorsement, through supporting First Nations building standards, and by supporting cultural newcomers to the construction industry. cfbc.ca. Help save lives. Go to tradespodcast.com and click on the link under Enter to win a $200 grocery card. When you fill out the survey, you help us understand what's working and what's not. Each survey for each episode listened to is a separate entry. Information collected is for survey purposes only and is not shared. Help us help you.